All right, so Marc Raimondi joining us here from ESPN, of course, ESPN Nation, NFL Reporter, Atlanta Falcons, but also he covers MMA, all right, for a long time and has a new book out now. It's coming out. You can pre-order anywhere you get your books. Say hello to the bad guys. I mean, Marc, the fact that what are we talking about? 28 years later.
28 years, yes.
Okay, 28 years, like that off the top of my head, 28 years after the nWo formed, that we are still writing new books about the nWo. I mean, if that's not an example of how important and the staying power, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the reasons why it's even more relevant to write about now than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, is you need time to really take a bird's eye view of how and why it impacted society and culture and America as a whole. You can't determine that in 5 years. You can't even determine that in 10 years, but almost 30 years from now, you can kind of see what the ripple effects have been, what the domino effect has been. And that's why the book makes sense now, in my opinion.
So how did it come about that, yeah, you know what? I know it was 28 years ago. I'm sure you've been working on it for a couple of years. So whatever the time frame was, where it's like, yeah, you know what? I think I'm going to write a really interesting nWo book.
Okay, so this is how it happened. So I am sitting in a hotel room. It's 2021. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I'm covering the UFC, and that was my job for 11 years. I pretty much followed the UFC around for over a decade, and I covered all their big events, right? So I'm sitting in a hotel room in Houston, Texas, and I get an email. And the email is from someone who says they're an editor at Simon & Schuster, right? One of the biggest book publishers on earth ever. And they want to know if I want to write a book about the nWo. So of course, Jonathan, the first thing that I think is, well, this is BS, right? This is a scam. There's just no possible way, me being a lifelong pro wrestling fan. Yes, I've covered combat sports for a long time, but at my heart, I'm a fan, and I still consume wrestling, and I have since I was really some of my oldest memories are wrestling. So I thought it was BS. I thought it was some kind of a con. So I did a little research into who this editor was, and it turns out it was real. And we spoke on the phone really minutes later because I was so juiced up. I was so amped up for this opportunity. And it's not an easy process to go about writing a book. There's a lot of steps that needed to be taken. So that was in 2021. Didn't get really an official deal until 2022. And the book won't come out until 2025, but the pre-order is up now. But yeah, it's just one of those things. And as I was saying earlier, man, the vision is to write about the nWo, but also to look at it as almost a vehicle for what that time period in the 90s and how it affected pop culture. What did it do? What was it? How did it happen? And what are the effects of it now moving forward almost 3 decades later? So it's definitely a wrestling book. There's no doubt. I think wrestling fans will dig it. But I think it's also more than that in a sense, because I interviewed academics, I interviewed sociologists, I interviewed media experts, cable television experts, culture experts. And that's what I think is going to differentiate this book from all the other, modes of whatever. There's been a lot of things written and said about the nWo and about WCW. I think this is what differentiates it.
So as a fan, you certainly knew a lot about nWo. I know a lot about the nWo. But when you're researching the book and you're talking to the players involved, what were some of the things that's like, holy shit, I did not know that?
I think that one of the most illuminating things about the nWo and how that storyline happened is it was very fly by the seat of your pants, right? There was definitely planning on the part of Eric Bischoff and others, but a lot of it was very done by feel and done by instinct and kind of done by, hey, we got to get something going because we got to put on a show on Monday night. We got to figure something out. So it was very we look at it back now so long after, and we see it as art, right? This masterpiece, this thing that was, it's like a Picasso painting. It's almost perfect, right? How they did it. But really it was scattered at the time. It was not this brilliantly laid out thing. It was kind of scattershot at times. Even, when Scott Hall comes down, it's how, what does that look like? What is that supposed to look like when he leaves on that Nitro on May 27th, 1996 to go to back wherever he was? He goes back through the entrance ramp. It's like, wait, if he's an invader, how is he going back to the
That's right.
It's like these things, like, and none of it really mattered ultimately, but it just kind of shows you that sometimes even great art is, kind of piecemeal and kind of chaotic.
Were you able to get a hold of everyone you wanted to talk to?
Not necessarily. So I did not actually interview Hulk Hogan or Kevin Nash for the book. And it's a bummer that I couldn't, and I wish I could have. It just didn't work out with either one of them. The one thing that I was able to get is I was able to get interviews from them. I didn't do them, but I was able to obtain interviews from them that have never been heard before. And there are quotes in there that have never been said before. And their opinions on certain things that happened in that time period have not surfaced as far as I know. So there is new stuff there, even though I did not speak to them actually one-on-one.
That's cool. Have you been paying attention lately, Vice TV's Dark Side of the Ring? Because the timing of your book coming out, or at least you announcing it's available for pre-order, tremendous timing.
Complete coincidence, honestly. And I have not started watching that yet because I've been a little busy. I cover the Falcons for ESPN, like you said, and it's been their spring program, and I've been busy covering the team and everything, and I've been doing book stuff. So it's I definitely will watch it the kind of off season, if there really is an off season in the NFL, which look, there really isn't. But I have the next few weeks to kind of get some stuff in that I've wanted to get in, and that's definitely at the top of my list.
Is the nWo, are they the undisputed greatest faction ever in pro wrestling?
I don't think there's any doubt. I don't think there's any doubt. I know that there are other contenders. I know that, D-Generation X, we're talking about the Four Horsemen, even like later on, people say the Bloodline now is a big one. But I think to me, it comes down to one thing: effect, impact. Which group had the greatest impact? There is no doubt that it's the nWo. It changed the course of wrestling history.
People are still buying. I still see them wearing nWo shirts. D-Generation. What do you got there? Oh, there you go.
It's a great Muta.
There you go.
Shirt. Yeah.
There you go. I don't see very many new D-Generation X shirts. Mm-hmm. I don't see anyone wearing Four Horsemen shirts. Yep. I see people wearing nWo shirts all the time still. And like we said, this is almost 30 years ago. Okay, the Bloodline's amazing, obviously. But do you think in 30 years from now, are Bloodline shirts still going to be sold?
Probably not. And I give them a ton of credit for what they've been able to do, because the era is so different. There's so many more things that we have now as far as entertainment, social media. People's heads are in their screens 24/7, and still WWE and Roman Reigns and Paul Heyman were able to devise this compelling story that did capture at least part of the zeitgeist. But it's nowhere near what the nWo was. Think about the people that were watching, right, at that time in the 90s. We're talking about tens of millions of people in 98, right, watching professional wrestling on TV. There's not even a fraction of that right now. So it's a big difference. And that's why I think that people are still wearing these shirts. If you look, man, like Urban Outfitters, a pretty popular, brand, pretty popular store, Pacific Sun, Pac Sun, they just recently put out retro pro wrestling shirt lines. And this stuff is coming back. It's relevant again because of that impact that it had, because it was so big in the 90s and people remember it, And one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is I wanted to kind of trace that impact from the 90s to today. And one of my, hypotheses is so many people were watching the nWo, WCW, WWF back in the early to mid 90s, mid to late 90s, right? And these were all mostly men in their teens, 20s, 30s. We've all grown up now, right? That's me, that's you. And we're all doing different things in the world. And some of us are leaders of our aspects of society. How can what we watched back then in our formative years not affect everything that we do? And I think that we see that in cable news, sports TV, politics. Social media. I think it's everywhere. I think kayfabe, lives on because of what we learned back in the 90s, because we're kind of the decision makers now in the United States, the people that watched that stuff back then.
The book here by Marc Raimondi, again, ESPN NFL Nation Falcons reporter. The book here, though, Say Hello to the Bad Guys. It's how professional wrestling's new world order changed America. So you hear him, Mark, there. It's not just about the nWo. It's about how the nWo ended up shaping and participated in pop culture. Do you remember where you were the night the nWo was formed?
Yes and no. So I don't remember. I mean, I have vague memories of watching it. I was home. I'm from Queens, New York. So I was home in Flushing, Queens at the time, right? And I remember watching Bash at the Beach. But one of my prevailing memories from that time, and I believe I was 11 years old. And I remember the next day was a Monday, right? And I remember getting to camp because it was summer, right? I was in a day camp in Bayside, Queens, New York, right? And I remember everyone was talking about, oh my God, Hulk Hogan is a bad guy. Oh, Jonathan, I remember this vividly, being at this camp, and everyone is buzzing about this, like, oh my God, Hulk Hogan what did he do? This is incredible. This is crazy. Like, everyone is talking about this at this camp. And that is honestly like one of my strongest memories from that period of time in my life when I was 11 years old.
I mean, how close, again, your book is on the New World Order and how it changed America. How close, like when you know the history, and of course, the way that it's told, that they didn't know for sure until it actually happened that Hogan was going to go through with it. It was always say your prayers and eat your vitamins. Is he going to abandon that? You don't know for sure. He could change on a whim. What if he decided, you know what? It's not right for me. They were probably going to go with Sting. He was the backup plan. I mean, just imagine, none of this would have happened if Hogan decided not to do it.
And you have to wonder, like, and I know that Hulk Hogan gets a lot of criticism, and some of it is warranted, right? But if he does not make that move, like you said, right, it changes the course of wrestling history. And then, if you're gonna say that I'm right what I'm saying about my hypothesis about America, it changes the course of American history to a certain extent, right? Because if it's Sting or if it's someone else, it doesn't carry nearly the impact that Hulk Hogan would have. And I think everyone would agree, even people back then, that, there was a little bit of a power struggle with, Hall and Nash and Hogan at times during that period. And I get into that in the book. But if Hogan does not join, does the Attitude Era happen, right? Like, if the nWo does not exist at the level and with the popularity that they have, does WCW start winning the Monday Night War? Right. And if they don't win the Monday Night War and they're not winning for 83 weeks, does Vince McMahon decide to actually go through with edgier programming, which became the Attitude Era? And no one knows the answer to that. Does Stone Cold Steve Austin become as big as, who knows? Like, that is like one of the interesting things about history, right? It's like sometimes just one thing, Hulk Hogan makes up his mind in Daytona Beach in Kevin Sullivan's townhouse, by the water, right? That's pretty much what happened. That's when he fully decided. And if that doesn't happen, if Kevin Sullivan can't convince him, and some of the other people in his life, which I get into the book, who did not want him to do it, if he listened to those people, what happens? What does pro wrestling look like now? Is it as pop? I mean, who knows? It's so hard to say.
Give me one of the guys who didn't want him to do it.
His ex-wife, Linda, did not want him to do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
My guess is because
his agents.
My guess is because merchandise, you're not going to have that anymore. They're not going to sell your shirts the way that they were, right? That's my guess.
Well, it's one of those things where the status quo, even like for someone like Hulk Hogan, right? It's like the status quo, even if he was not at the height as he was in the 80s, in the mid 80s, the status quo is still pretty darn good if you're Hulk Hogan in 1996, right? You're still making those big paychecks. He's just getting paid a mountain of money, right? Yeah. I mean, he's getting paid more than anyone else in the business at that time. He's getting, a percentage of the pay-per-view every time he's on pay-per-view. And his merch is still massive, right? So there are people, and I understand it, right? Because you don't know what this is going to turn into. Maybe this is a giant bust. So it was a risk for him in a sense, right? It was a risk. But I think he also knew that there was a decline in his popularity, and he was getting booed a little bit by fans back then, even though he was the babyface. He was not being received well, and I think he's one of the most brilliant minds in wrestling history, and I it's one of those weird things that he doesn't get the credit anymore, and that kind of, and I know there's been controversy, but I think that he's very good about seeing where the wind is blowing in the professional wrestling business. He has a tremendous mind for the business, and he can see the trends and the ebbs and the flows. And he saw this thing, and he saw his own decline in his popularity, and he said, "This is what I have to do at this point in my career to continue to stay relevant." I mean, who else in the history of wrestling has been the biggest star of the 80s? Biggest star of the 80s, WrestleMania 1, movies, celebrities, the whole deal. Mr. America, right, in the 80s. And then reinvents himself completely and becomes the catalyst for the boom in the 90s. I mean, it's a career like no other. It really is.
Do you know if Hogan and Nash have any kind of relationship still?
They do. And it's funny because, like, there are points in 1998, especially, that they were at each other's throats, and it was it got really bad at certain points, like really bad. But ultimately, they were always able to work together because they were so smart about the business, and they were like there's been situations recently, and I don't want to get too much into like the current day, where fights have happened, right, in professional wrestling, and some people did not want to do business because of hard feelings and not liking the other person, or maybe feeling threatened by the other person physically or what have you. But as crazy as things were in the 90s with these guys, when there was drugs and there was alcohol flowing freely, right, those guys were always able to put their differences aside and do business with one another, even though they really did not like each other. And that is as extended to today. And they are still friends, and they do. I mean, friends is, I guess, a light term, but they talk, and there is a solidarity and a camaraderie there, even if they're not, BFFs. I did talk with Kevin Nash a little bit, and one thing he told me is there was a thing that he was approached, like, for a documentary about Hulk Hogan, and someone approached him about it, a producer, and he said, "Hold on," and he called Hulk, and he said, "What is this thing? Are you involved in it?" And Hulk told him, "No, I'm not involved in this at all. It's a hit piece or whatever." And Kevin Nash said, "You know what? F them. I'm not doing this." So there still is that loyalty.
I like hearing that.
Yeah. There's still, look, Jonathan, it's nWo, and when you're nWo, for life.
You're for life. It's interesting, Mark, because when I was a kid, like, it sounds like I'm 3 or 4 years older than you. If you were 11 at the time it happened, I was 15. Back then, this shit was not cool. All right, wrestling was my thing. I didn't have other friends to talk about it with. It was the thing I did on my own, watched on my own. I would get my magazine in the mail every month, and that was the thing for me. And I think nWo probably played such a major role where now, all these years later, this shit is cool now. Like, nobody's afraid to mention that they love pro wrestling. I mean, granted, I'm in my early 40s, so there's not really things to be embarrassed about anymore. I'm a grown up, but I'll talk on national radio. I love pro wrestling. I'm not afraid that anyone knows that I love pro wrestling. And nWo probably played a major role in that.
100%. I mean, when you see Kendall Jenner wearing an nWo Wolfpack shirt like 5 or 6 years ago in New York at a fashion show, you're like, what is going on here? Because it's true. And I think that was the period of time in the mid to late 90s, especially for me growing up in New York. I was kind of like that too early on when I was younger. It was not cool. The early 90s, not a cool time to be a wrestling fan. Not a cool time for wrestling. It was pretty bad, right? But a lot of it was pretty bad. But when the nWo came along, and then when Stone Cold Steve Austin came along, you could not go out in New York without seeing an Austin 316 shirt or an nWo shirt or a DX shirt or then like a Rock shirt. It really captured the zeitgeist as far as pop culture goes during that time period, at least from what I saw being in New York. It was massive. And you were actually on the outside if you were not talking about it at that time. You know, you had to kind of be in the know about what was going on in wrestling because that's what everyone was talking about.
I am looking forward to reading this. Again, the book is Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. Marc Raimondi, of course, ESPN, NFL Nation, Falcons reporter. You could order the book right now, wherever you are, wherever you sell books, or wherever they sell books. You don't sell books. Wherever they sell books, you could order it right now. I am very much looking forward to this. Are you very much looking forward to Clash at the Castle in Glasgow, Scotland? Are you into it, Mark?
I'm into it. I will be honest. I have not followed as closely since WrestleMania as I normally would, just because I've started this new job. Right. I only started on this Falcons beat 2 months ago. The NFL draft was my first week on the beat, and I was covering combat sports up until
what a week to start with the Falcons, the NFL draft,
kidding.
and you got the whole situation with with Michael
No
Penix.
kidding.
That's an introduction to the NFL right there, Mark.
No kidding. I mean, look, for someone who's covered MMA and pro wrestling for a long time, that fit right in with what I do. So that I was like, all right. I know how to deal with this type of stuff. But yeah, no, I mean, I covered WrestleMania 40, right, in Philly, and then I went to UFC 300, and then I moved myself to Atlanta to cover the Falcons for ESPN. It's just an awesome opportunity. I'm really excited about covering the NFL. It's the NFL. I mean, I'm just so stoked about training camp and the season and everything. But I'll always have my love for combat sports, and wrestling is like a lifelong thing. I'll never stop loving professional wrestling.
Awesome. Great job, Mark. Appreciate you spending some time with us here on the show today. Thank you so much. And best of luck with the book. I mean, like I said, I can't wait to read it. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, really appreciate it. Hopefully maybe when it gets closer, we can chat again. I got some more good stories for you from the book and otherwise.
Awesome. Great job.